Pass the buck. I think we've all heard that phrase before. It means to give somebody else responsibility, or it means to pass the blame to somebody else. You're passing the buck. It started in the mid-1800s, they think, in the Old West, the Wild West. The cowboys would come into town, they'd go into the bar, they'd gather around the round tables, they'd start playing poker. They decided that the best way to be as fair as possible with poker was to make sure that everybody had a chance to deal, because the dealer has the best chance to, do some sleight of hand to have the advantage. So they decided everybody needed to deal. Now, sometimes the games got kind of heated, sometimes they got kind of long, and so they decided the best way to remember who the next dealer was to put some type of marker by the next person. So a person was to shuffle the cards, to deal the cards, and then move the marker to the next person. So however long the game took, they knew that this was the person to deal next. Well, cowboys, what do cowboys have with them whenever they're wanting to put a marker out? They've either got their gun or they've got a knife. And most cowboys of that day had knives that had antlers as handles. And so they would pull out their knife and they would put it on the card table, and that was what they would use to pass around as the marker. And it usually had an antler as a handle. And what animal has an antler on it? A buck. And so the phrase, pass the buck, came along. In the early 1800s, that phrase jumped from the poker table into some written correspondence, into some papers, and it came to mean what we didn't know it as today, pass the buck. Well, in the mid-1900s, a marshal, United States Marshal by the name of Fred Canfield, was in a federal reformatory in Enid, Oklahoma. Now, I'm not trying to speak bad about my own state here, but I just happened to be where he was. And he saw a sign on a wall there, and actually the wall of the guy who was overseeing the reformatory. And he thought, I like that sign, and I know somebody else who will like that sign as well. And so he had this sign made and sent to his good friend Harry S. Truman. And that sign remained on Truman's desk for most of his presidency. Does anybody know what that sign says? The buck stops here. The buck stops here. Harry S. Truman was very conscientious on his personal responsibility for the decisions he made as president. Even in his farewell address in 1953, he made this statement: the president, whoever he is, has to decide. He can't pass the buck to anyone else. No one else can do the deciding for him. That's his job. Today we're continuing in our series in the book of Luke, and we're looking at the issue of authority. Authority. In our key passage this morning, the Foster just read, religious leaders came to Jesus and were questioning him about his authority. And they specifically asked him, where did your authority come from? Who gave it to you? Now, if you were to read the Gospels, and I'm sure you've read them many times and seen this, the authors of the Gospels use the word authority. I'd encourage you, the next time you read through a Gospel, have a marker or a pen or pencil and circle every time it says authority in relation to Jesus, because it talks about him speaking with authority. It talks about Jesus using authority to drive out demons and to heal people. Talks about Jesus giving his authority to his disciples to do the same thing. The authors of the Gospels talk about Jesus having authority to forgive sins. And then one of the key passages we know of Jesus and what he said just before he ascended into heaven is in Matthew 28:18. And Jesus says this, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now, that's a pretty far-reaching statement. Jesus doesn't say some authority has been given to me. Jesus doesn't say partial authority has been given to me. Jesus doesn't say most authority has been given to me. Jesus says all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So let's talk about authority today. Now let's make sure that we understand the setting of our story. In my sermon last week, I pointed out that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. So I've been preaching through Luke as we kind of go along from point to point. I haven't been jumping around. And so Jesus last week was on his way to Jerusalem. This week he's made it to Jerusalem. He's there. Now, last week's sermon on Zacchaeus was in Luke chapter 19. The first verse is there, and the first verse is today, the end of Luke 19. And so a lot has happened in Luke 19. Jesus has met with Zacchaeus. Jesus has begun or continued his trip to Jerusalem. He's gotten on the outside of Jerusalem. He told his disciples to go look for a donkey and a colt and to bring those to him, that he's going to ride them into Jerusalem. He gets on and rides it into Jerusalem. The people are laying their coats down before him and praising him, worshiping him. He stops at a certain point and he looks out across to Jerusalem and he cries for Jerusalem because he knows what's about to happen. He knows that the people are going to receive him at first but then turn against him. He knows that he's going to be crucified, and he knows that eventually Jerusalem is going to fall completely, which happened in 70 A.D. And so he cries for Jerusalem. Luke then records that the first thing he does when he arrives in Jerusalem is he goes to the temple. And that's where he drives the money changers and those selling the sheep and the pigeons, the doves out of the temple. And the event that we heard this morning that Foster read to us, beginning in verse 47, is an interesting statement because it says the next day, it doesn't actually say the next day, but it says every day he was teaching in the temple, but the chief priests and the teachers of the law, the leaders of the people, were trying to kill him. This is interesting to me. That must have been very difficult for everyone to Jesus have had gone into the temple, and he had made a whip and he was whipping people and turning things over, and then the next day he goes back and he starts teaching in the temple, and every day after that he teaches in the temple. We sometimes miss this. It was not Jesus's, according to the leaders of the temple that day, it was not Jesus's authority to do what he did. It was not Jesus' responsibility to do what he did. And that's why in verse 48 it tells us they wanted to kill him, because he came in and did something he wasn't supposed to do. And then he just didn't leave. He came back again. And he started teaching again. Started preaching again. And so the leaders, man, they're angry with Jesus. And I think if you and I were to put ourselves in the leaders' shoes, we could understand their anger. I mean, let's think of it this way. If somebody were to come in here this morning and stand in the back and talk about what we teach here at this church is not right, and not just me as I preach, but all of our Sunday school teachers, and if those people somebody would call us hypocrites and all other kinds of names. And if we started passing our offering plates around, they came over and started dumping the money out of them all over the floor here, I would have a problem with that. I would have an issue with that. I would say, now wait a minute, who do you think you are? And what do you think you're doing? And that's I hope I wouldn't want to kill the person. But that's exactly what we find in this story. Jesus had gone into the temple where he hadn't spent a whole lot of time. He spent most of his ministry in northern Israel. He went to the temple now. He got into the temple. He was well known. People knew he was coming. They were following him. But he got into the temple and he began to turn over everything. And then he would come back and he would teach. And he would teach things that really made these religious leaders look bad. As a matter of fact, if you look in the middle of chapter 20, there beginning in verse 9, I'm not going to read it, but it's a parable of the tenants and how these tenants took over this farm, and how the owner of the farm tried to send people to get the money from them, and they would hurt him and beat him and injure him, and he sent his son and he killed the son. And it says these leaders realized Jesus was speaking against them. And they're the leaders of the temple. No wonder they were angry with Jesus. We look from this side of history and we think, man, Jesus is the hero, and he was the hero. But boy, if we place ourselves into this scene and what's happening, we have to say, wow, no wonder these guys are mad at Jesus. These religious leaders, they were the ones who decided what happened at the temple. They were the ones who decided who could teach at the temple and what the people could teach. They were the ones who decided who could sell their goods at the temple. They were the ones who decided how much they could charge for the goods at the temple. These were the people who were in charge. And so that's why they came to Jesus. And they said to Jesus, hey, wait a minute. Under whose authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority? They decided that they needed to get rid of Jesus, but they didn't want to do it themselves. They wanted to get the Romans to do it for him, and they decided that that was the best way for him to die. Now, they came up with a plan for that to happen. I want to read another passage. Look there at verses 20 through 26. You've heard this passage before. It's well known, but let me read this to you. In verses 20 through 26, and remember, we're still dealing with the whole issue of authority right now, okay? That's the context. It says, keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies. Now, the him is Jesus, and the they is the leaders of the temple. They sent spies who pretended to be sincere. They hoped to catch Jesus in something he said so that they might hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. So they were hoping he would say something against Rome so that they could take him and give him to the Romans, so that the Romans would take care of him for them. So the spies questioned him, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? He saw through their duplicity and said to them, Show me a denarius. Whose inscription and whose image are on it? Caesar's, they replied. He said to them, Then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. One way that you would be seen as an insurgent, a rebel against the Roman Empire, was to not pay your tribute tax. The tribute tax, everybody that every country Rome conquered, every citizen of that country was required to pay a tribute tax once a year. And that was basically to show that Rome had authority over that person, had power over that person. And so every citizen of Palestine was required to pay a tribute tax of 1 denarius to Rome every year. Here's a denarius. You see it on the screen behind me as well. This is an actual one of them. This is owned by Rick Klobuchar. Rick let me borrow it today to use it, to show it to you. And Rick, I already forgot the number. How many million? 600 million were minted? 675 million of these were minted during Emperor Tiberius's reign, which was during the time of Christ. Okay? So 675 million of those were minted. And so it's a possibility, 1 in 675 million, that this is actually the one that Jesus used to say, show me a denarius. So this could have been touched by Jesus. And here's what's going on. To not pay that tax was to be seen as an act of disloyalty to the emperor and to the empire. And in essence, that was an act of treason. You see, every time a new emperor came into power, new coins were minted with the emperor's image on that coin. And the coin was particularly for the tribute tax. And see, what happened is such a practice made the statement that the person paying the tribute was submitting to the emperor's rule, was saying, I accept the Roman Empire over me. But it went even more than just the emperor's rule, because you see, and I think I've mentioned this before, Roman emperors viewed themselves as gods. They actually viewed themselves as gods. As a matter of fact, the first emperor, Augustus, was deified by the Roman Empire. And then everyone after that was considered to be one of his sons. And so you see, not only is his picture there, you see an inscription around it. And the inscription around this coin says this: Caesar Augustus Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. Or in other words, son of God. Son of God. This story isn't as clear to us, but for everyone who gathered around Jesus that day and on this occasion, they knew that these people trying to trick Jesus were trying to get him to say, I'm not going to give allegiance to this God. And in doing that, he would be seen as a traitor. You know, some people think that this story is simply about paying taxes, but gosh, it's deeper than that. I do believe there's an element of truth to, yes, it's right when we live under a government and are part of that government that there's responsibility for us as citizens. But this goes much deeper than just, do we pay our taxes or not? The question is, who is your authority in your life? Who is your authority? You see, Rome was the greatest empire that had ever existed up to that point. Man, it offered protection and security for the citizens. It offered stability and strength. Man, it offered fun and enjoyment. They had all kinds of games in their main cities of that day. It offered all of the modern conveniences of that day. It offered everything you could want. All you had to do was pay your tribute tax to be a part of it. Now, I love what Jesus does in this story. Instead of looking in his own purse pocket, instead of asking for one of his disciples for a coin, he asks the people who were trying to trick him, give me a denarius. And they had one. The very people who were trying to trick him into seeing whose allegiance he would give himself to had this coin, which indicated they were already giving their allegiance to Rome. Jesus says to them, well, I tell you what, give to Caesar what's Caesar, what is Caesar's. This coin, this tribute tax, was literally considered to be Caesar's money. And so in giving it back, it was really not like paying taxes. It was like giving. Caesar didn't need any more money. Caesar wanted allegiance. So giving this tribute tax was like saying, I give my allegiance to Caesar. So Jesus says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. That's okay. Go ahead and give it to him. You're living under his rule. You're living under his protection. You're living under his modern conveniences. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. But don't stop there. Give also to God what belongs to God. Now here's the question. What belongs to God? If we're talking about images on a coin, do you remember a passage in the Bible that talks about another image on somebody else? In Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, in the creation, it says this: So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Folks, this denarius, it's a piece of metal. It's an inanimate object. It has the image of a man on it who thought he was God. But here's what the Bible teaches us. You and I are living beings, breathing beings, intelligent beings who have the very image of God stamped on us. And Jesus says, give to God what belongs to God. And here's my one key point. All of this has been to get to one key point of the sermon today, and that's this. God is our ultimate authority. God. God is our ultimate authority. We belong to Him. We exist because of Him. We live in Him and through Him and by Him. We live in a culture that wants us to submit to it, and I would suggest, I'm not just saying that about America, whatever country somebody lives into, that country wants a citizen to submit to it. Our culture wants us to buy its things. It wants us to worship its idols. It wants us to pay its tribute tax. And because we live here and we live under its protection and security, we as citizens have a responsibility to support its existence and to work for its betterment. And that's part of our responsibility. But folks, as followers of Christ, we should never submit to it as our ultimate authority. Only God holds that place in our lives. Yes, let's give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. But let's also give to God what belongs to God. Let's pray.